Hello everyone and welcome into the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. My name as always is Christopher Shepard. Thank you all for tuning in on this very cold Tuesday afternoon here in the tri-state area, but hopefully this show will brighten your day as we talk all of the sports that you know and love. Starting off by recapping a divisional round game, the best perhaps of the weekend. Bills-Ravens. They'll be getting into the surprising news of Ben Johnson finalizing a deal to become the Chicago Bears' new head coach. Then I'll be doing an interesting thing. I'm going to be looking at the Vikings' options should Sam Darnold leave, and to J.J. McCarthy. It's a very interesting debate here. Not a lot of people are thinking about it, but I wanted to present an interesting case study just because. And then I'm looking at, in men's college basketball, the player of the year race and the freshman of the year race. Is Flag gaining ground on Johnny Broome due to Broome's injury? Or can Broome come back and prove why he is the best player in men's college basketball? And then concluding with a preview of a nice weekend matchup in the Premier League between two top six sides, Man City and Chelsea. Can they both find their footing in this one? Before we get into any of that exciting stuff, I do want to remind you, as always, to like, follow, and subscribe to the show and the network if you want to keep up to date with all our new content, not just for my show, but all the shows around the network. But if you want to contribute and interact with the shows a little bit more directly, consider making yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube. As always, great way to share your input, share your opinions about certain things throughout the show as they come up. It just makes it that much better, and it is genuinely appreciated by all, not just me, but around the network in advance. Without further ado, let us jump right into our first divisional round recap here, starting off with the exciting Sunday night match between the Bills and the Ravens that ended with a Buffalo victory 27-25. And a lot of people will throw around the word blame for this game. We make no ands, ifs, or buts about it. These are two exceptional teams with little to separate them, and one of them just had to make a couple more mistakes than the other, and it just turned out it was Baltimore. Not to say that this indicts the Baltimore Ravens, not to say that they'll never break through in the postseason with Lamar Jackson. It's just that this game could have gone any way. And it just so happened that the Baltimore Ravens, in the critical moments in the game, did not take advantage of Buffalo's mishaps. And Buffalo, for the most part, played disciplined football. They played a conservative game that allowed them to make key decisions that ultimately were the difference in this matchup, whereas the Baltimore Ravens played a little bit too erratically in certain moments of the game and lost that little bit of control that the Bills ultimately had. And so that's what separated these two teams. I'm going to talk about the turnovers that define this game, but let's not think that Baltimore could not have won this game either outside of the turnovers, because they had their destiny in front of them, and it was just that Mark Andrews drop that separated them from potentially taking this one into overtime. So let's not get ahead of ourselves and say Mark Andrews is to blame, Lamar Jackson is to blame, because no one really was to blame in a game where it was just two spectacular teams going up against each other, and one of them had to lose. But let's talk about the big stars of this game and the key aspects and calls that occurred during this game, because it really was an interesting one. Let's start off with Josh Allen's performance. Only 127 passing yards in this one, 16 of 22, but the 2 rush yards showed how he has matured throughout his NFL career, especially during this season. Because last season, some of the decisions he made in this game would most likely have been turnovers. For example, late in the game, when they were driving on what ultimately became their game-sealing field goal drive, Josh Allen decides to keep it, and then at the last second it looks like he might pitch it back to James Cook. And if he had done so, they'd even scoop it up, potentially win a touchdown going the other way. But no, he decides to keep the football, preserve the choice for Sean McDermott, of going for it on fourth down or kicking the field goal, ultimately not leaving it up to chance. That shows the signs of a mature quarterback no matter what the passing stats look like. Because in this game, it wasn't about Josh Allen as being a superhero. Even though a lot of people were saying, hey, two of these guys, one of them is going to win the MVP. Let's see who's better in this game. And if you actually look at the stats, Lamar, even though he had more mistakes, did quote-unquote play better statistically than Josh Allen. But Josh Allen proved that he was more valuable in what he didn't do in this game than what he did end up doing. Because what he didn't do was turn the ball over. And what he did do was control the game for his team and made critical choices that ultimately decided the game in Buffalo's favor. But then on the Lamar Jackson side of things, let's not forget that even with the turnovers, he played a pretty perfect second half. And he was the main reason as to why they were a Mark Andrews dropped 2-point conversion away from extending this game and sending it to overtime, potentially winning there. 18 of 25, 254 yards, 2 touchdowns, 1 interception. So you can't necessarily pin it all on Lamar because what he did was keep his team in this game, even though, for the most part, the turnovers were what decided it. But my bigger question is this. You have these two situations where you're going for two, if you're the Ravens. And throughout the game, Isaiah Likely has, for the most part, been the better tight end. So, late in the third quarter when you're going for your first 2-point conversion, it's a deflected pass by Matt Lamano, who, by the way, was also the difference for Buffalo, if you want to look at it that way, in terms of someone on Buffalo's defense stepping up. But I do believe the targeted man was Mark Andrews. Then in the second 2-point conversion, to tie everything up to potentially send this game to overtime, you get the perfect play call to Mark Andrews, but he drops it. And remember before, he was the one who fumbled when they were driving that ultimately cost them potentially good drive in which they could have scored a field goal or a touchdown and really helped themselves. But I do think that you can't necessarily blame Mark Andrews in that situation just because he dropped it, because it was the perfect play call. In fact, I think that both of those 2-point conversions were perfect play calls, in my opinion. They were just executed poorly. And so my question is, for my receiving MVP for the Ravens, Isaiah Likely, why not scheme up something for him? He seemed to have more of an impact in this one. He seemed to trouble the Bills' defense a little bit more. He seemed to be exploiting the zone coverage that the Bills employed a little bit better. So why not draw something up for him? I know that Mark Andrews is a Pro Bowl tight end, but it was just not his day. He had the fumble, and clearly he did not look like himself for very large portions of this game. Not until, say, the late third to late fourth quarter did he really show up. And so that's my ultimate question. If the Ravens trusted Isaiah Likely a little bit more, does this game turn out differently? But then again, the 3 turnovers are what people are going to pinpoint in this one. Because you can't turn the football over in postseason matchups. And that's what the Ravens ultimately did. It doesn't matter who's getting the targets. It doesn't matter how Lamar plays in just the second half. It matters their overall play throughout 4 quarters. And Lamar made some critical moments throughout the game that at the time didn't seem that they would come back to bite the Ravens, but ultimately was the difference. As for the Bills, it wasn't necessarily pretty. They were outgained in this matchup, which ironically was the main theme for all the winners in perhaps the first time ever where all 4 winners of the divisional round were outgained by their opponents. But the thing is, sometimes ball control wins games. And it may piss a lot of people off, but ultimately, it's what Buffalo needed to do in that situation. They were right in saying that people doubted them because they were slower, because they were smaller, because they were faster, because in most areas, Baltimore had them beat. They have better offensive weapons. Their defense have been playing like one of the best in the NFL ever since the playoffs started. And to top it all off, Lamar Jackson was playing MVP caliber football. And so, looking at the game plan for Buffalo, chances were that they weren't going to be explosive at any given point throughout the game. But timeliness does matter in today's NFL. And if you can accomplish it consistently, you're going to be a very good football team and a tough one to stop at that. That's what Buffalo is. They're a ball control offense now, where Josh Allen doesn't have to do too much, doesn't have to wear different hats. He controls the tempo of this offense, the rhythm of this offense, and thus nothing happens that negatively impacts the way they play. I don't necessarily know if it's going to work against the Chiefs. We'll see, because the Chiefs are a different animal in the postseason, especially the championship game. But the Bills now have a strategy where potentially they can control the football a little bit better than, say, Patrick Mahomes right now. As for the Ravens, it's going to be another long offseason where Lamar Jackson is yet again without a Lombardi trophy, and questions are going to be asked. If he wins his third MVP, when will he win his Super Bowl? Because all other two-time or more MVP winners have won Super Bowls. It's only Lamar who has not. And so that's going to be the ultimate question until he achieves postseason success. But for now, we're left wondering what could have been for Baltimore, and we're thinking of ways this Buffalo Bills team can be a little bit different in terms of the outcome of their championship matchup in Kansas City. But let me know what you think about this game in the comments below. Coming up next, we're going to be talking about some more surprising NFL news. Ben Johnson finalizing a deal to become the Chicago Bears' new head coach. We'll have more information and updates about that after this short break.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in
Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. Before we get into our second segment, I do want to remind you, as always, if you want to contribute and interact with the show a little bit more directly throughout its duration while we are live streaming, consider making yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube. As always, a great way to share your opinions and input on the show. You can also do it through our website, gsmcspodcast.net, as we see it on our ticker below. It's genuinely appreciated by all concerned what you do for our network to support us, because it just makes our shows that much better. But without further ado, let us jump right into our second segment, talking about the shocking news that arose yesterday in the NFL concerning Ben Johnson and his status as a potential head coach candidate, as he is now finalizing a deal to become the Chicago Bears' new head coach. Interdivisional movement in the NFL. But ultimately, I do think that this is a pretty good fit for Chicago. They got their man ahead of teams like Las Vegas, ahead of teams like Jacksonville, and it really says a lot about those other teams in terms of how quick and rapidly the Bears were able to get this deal across immediately, almost after the Lions lost in the divisional round. They pounced on him. But ultimately, with the way this organization is set up, the desire they have to get this project right, this seems like a very appropriate hire. It does not seem like a panic hire. It seems that they have a clear vision, both President Kevin Warren and GM Ryan Poles, in establishing Caleb Williams as their franchise quarterback, and Ben Johnson seems like the perfect guy to do it because of what he's been doing in Detroit. And they've been seeing it as a divisional opponent these past 3 years, and they immediately, once he became available, were not saying no again. So let's do a deep dive into the impact this will have on the Bears and how this will also impact the Detroit Lions, as other teams around the NFL, much like my own favorite team, the Seattle Seahawks, are looking for an offensive coordinator as well. And choices may be few and far between in that department, seeing as to how my Seattle Seahawks are struggling to find good candidates. Let's talk about the man of the hour right now, Ben Johnson, because he has had a very prolific career in the NFL with Detroit as their offensive coordinator and has paid dividends, especially this season, as for the first time ever, he led the Detroit Lions in his tenure to number one statistical rankings in every major important category. So without further ado, let's talk about how this will impact Caleb Williams. So, like I said, Ben Johnson, 3 years as the Detroit Lions offensive coordinator. He was fifth in total offense with them in both 2022 and 2023. But this year, his offense was number one in points per game with 28.2, yards per game with 395, touchdown percentage per drive at 33%, and red zone touchdown percentage at 67%. What you really want out of an NFL offense is that level of consistency. And throughout his tenure, he was able to turn Jared Goff, a seeming castaway after his career in Los Angeles, into one of the NFL's premier quarterbacks. He has been in the top 5 consistently in QBR throughout Ben Johnson's tenure. This is really a very nice hire for the Bears in terms of being able to develop Caleb Williams. Now, the reason why I also think offensively this is a fascinating fit, because the Bears have a very similar offense to the Lions in terms of setup. They have very good skill position weapons with running back DeAndre Swift, even though he had a very down year this year. They have Rome Odunze, they have Keenan Allen, and they have DJ Moore. So one of the best receiving corps in the NFL. The problem, though, is they don't necessarily have a speed guy, kind of a gadget guy, much like they have with Jameson Williams, where Ben Johnson was able to be innovative in how he used one of his wide receivers. They're all very clear-cut in terms of their intelligence, but no one is separating themselves in terms of being that explosive weapon. It could be Rome Odunze just because he's more of their vertical option. It could be DJ Moore because he loves playing on the outside a little bit more than the others. But I do think that analyzing this group and diagnosing who could be that really nice weapon that they could have in certain situations, potentially for trick plays, could be a nice thing to do for Ben Johnson when he gets in charge of this team. But also, ultimately, being able to develop young Caleb Williams is a big aspect of this job's importance. Caleb Williams had a decent year in terms of stats. He threw for over 3,000 yards. He had over 20 touchdowns. Pretty good for his rookie season. But he went 5-12, and in terms of QBR was only 28th. So something's going to need to improve for Caleb Williams. And while you can look at the offensive line, a lot of it was because of Caleb Williams' erratic play. He never truly looked fully comfortable for a consistent period of time in this Bills offense. There was one time where With Thomas Brown inserted as the offensive coordinator, he did look a little bit comfortable because Thomas Brown freed up a lot of options for him, but ultimately never really consistently got into a rhythm as the Bears quarterback this past season. And it might just have been because of that offensive line, but in terms of how you can scheme for that, Caleb Williams was the perfect quarterback to overcome that adversity, right? And I do feel like the failure of all of these offensive coordinators, because granted, he did have 4 his entire rookie season. He had interim offensive coordinators after Thomas Brown became the head coach. He had Thomas Brown. He had, I believe, was it Nat Nagy initially to start out the season? I'm not completely certain because that was how many times the Bears hired and fired offensive coordinators throughout the season. But that inconsistency also was a negative for this rookie season for Caleb Williams. But I do feel like with Ben Johnson in place, he's going to start to have structure to his performances as well, no matter the outlook of this offensive line, which is something they're going to improve in the draft. We'll talk about this more towards the end of this segment, but I do feel like by making sure that Caleb Williams knows the freedom he has in this offense to create the structure, to be consistent in how he throws down the field, be consistent in taking what the defense gives him, and most importantly, maturing off the field as well, will make him a little bit more consistent and give more hope to the Chicago fan base. So I do think offensively, Ben Johnson is the right fit for Caleb Williams, at least physically and mentally. But here's potentially the caveats with Ben Johnson. One thing is that he's not necessarily going to be focused on a defense, which I really think could be a sneaky contender to break into the top 10 defenses next year. They have a lot of young talent. I really like the outlook of their secondary, and I really wanted to see if the Bears would have gone that route and hired someone like Aaron Glenn, his buddy over in Detroit. But at the end of the day, I do feel like the biggest question is, how will Ben Johnson's staff look? Who does he trust? Who is his circle that will ultimately help bolster the Chicago Bears franchise? And that's what I'm interested in. We haven't really heard any rumors of how he's going to build his staff, but the one name that I've heard is former Saints head coach, who was just fired himself, Dennis Allen. And yes, Dennis Allen is more of a defensive-minded coach and could work, but with New Orleans, it didn't really come to fruition. As Tapton says, who in particular do you like in the Bears defense? I like a number of players. Let's start off with their secondary. I like corners Tyreek Stevenson. I like how Kyler Gordon looked this year. And I really liked as well the development of some guys along this front. Not just Sweat, who they already had and we already know can be one of their premier players, but a guy like Jervon Dexter. Really underrated, I believe, interior defensive lineman. And I really think that ultimately, in all 3 phases, they can point to leaders who I think can help develop this Bears defense to the point where it could be one of the NFL's elite. But ultimately, we're going to have to see how Ben Johnson hires at the defensive coordinator position to really determine whether or not they can make that jump. Because it's ultimately going to come up to Ben Johnson's decision making in terms of what I think after the fact. Because at face value, this is a very solid transfer. It allows Caleb Williams to grow. It allows this offense to diversify. But I am concerned with the defense. Another thing I'm concerned about is because of the positioning of the Bears' first-round pick, I'm not necessarily certain you go for a position of greater need or just the best player available. Because, as also Tap to Learn suggests, that I feel like a lot of offensive linemen will be available for you at the 10 spot, but I'm not certain that they will be the best, because Kelvin Banks, I feel like, is going to be the top tackle off the board. And he could go as high as 5. He could go as low as 10. And then a guy like Will Campbell's another solid player who's going to have to develop a little bit and can play multiple positions along your line, but I'm not necessarily certain. I feel like since Ben Johnson is offense-oriented, he's going to want to build through that offensive line because that's similar to what the Lions did and how he observed Dan Campbell building that squad. But ultimately, I do think that you might have to consider best player available should both of those guys be off the board. But Kelvin Banks and Will Campbell will be the two names on the Bears' minds come draft day. Now let's look at the Lions side of things, because this is an interesting debate. Because everyone thinks that Dan Campbell was a huge reason as to the success. And he kind of was. But he's more of the motivational guy than the X's and O's guy, the nuts and bolts guy. Both Johnson and Glenn were fantastic hires that really paid dividends for how they coached. And now it's going to be Dan Campbell's responsibility, not just to replace them, but prove that this team can still remain consistent in the loaded NFC so that he's not potentially viewed as a fraud in Detroit. Because right now, a lot of people think that Detroit's Super Bowl window is closing or already closed. So he's going to have to find a way to compensate for this loss, potentially the loss of Aaron Glenn, who's getting a lot of hype for that Jets job. But I do think that ultimately this particular hire for the Bears was a no-brainer. And subsequently for the Lions, they have a lot of work to do to diagnose their top candidate in the offseason. Let me know what you think in the comments below about this hire as well, because coming up next, we transition over to the Vikings, another NFC North debate, and their options should an interesting situation occur in their quarterback room. We'll be right back after this short break.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free.
Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast, brought to us always by the GSMC Sports Network. And we're going to address a comment that Tap to Learn made over the break, suggesting that the NFC North is up for grabs on our third segment. I thought it would be an interesting case study after I read an article about last week about the Vikings' options should Sam Darnold leave. Now, I know a lot of you will be skeptical and apprehensive about this segment, especially some Vikings fans who I know are in here. But I do think it's an interesting debate, right? Because there is a lot of rumors concerning the status of Sam Darnold in Minnesota. And while it's very likely that he will ultimately stay, potentially as the bridge if they don't feel McCarthy is ready, it's going to be intriguing to see which teams are potential suitors for him. And then one thing this article didn't address really well was the status of J.J. McCarthy, because ultimately he's an unknown commodity and the Vikings didn't really get to see him at all in this rookie season. A lot of people consider him to be one of the best quarterbacks in that draft. But there have also been slight rumors as well that McCarthy could be traded. And while this is a 0 in 100 chance situation for the Vikings, it is an interesting debate here to explore their options should the ultimate chaos moment occur for them. And these three guys will ultimately make Vikings fans very nervous, but I thought it was just a very interesting article the way they analyzed this ultimate situation. So without further ado, if you're a Vikings fan, you might want to cover your ears. Let's talk with the three guys that could potentially be the saviors of Minnesota's 2025 season should everything go awry all of a sudden. And let's start off in Los Angeles talking about Jimmy Garoppolo. This is a guy who has experience as someone in the postseason. Definitely not the most attractive option if you're the Vikings, but someone who you know has been to the postseason, has worked in the McVay tree now, Kevin O'Connell stems from the McVay tree, so that connection could work in his favor. But it's ultimately more about the ambitions that Kevin O'Connell has in this offense. If he feels another game-managing kind of guy like Jimmy Garoppolo could work in this Vikings offense, by all means will be available on a cheap deal. But I do feel like Kevin O'Connell is someone who wants a guy like Darnold in that he can execute to all levels of the field and his arm talent can be put to good use, and Jimmy Garoppolo might not necessarily be the most appealing option, as Tapler says as well, in that department. He's more of someone who just allows for the team to coalesce around him, but not necessarily improving it of his own volition, so to speak. So while Jimmy Garoppolo has the experience, has been to the Super Bowl, stems from the McVay tree now, and the Shanahan tree for that matter, I don't necessarily think Vikings fans would love to see him walking through the door. But, like I said, in the most chaotic situation that could happen for Vikings, as Tattler also says, you get what you pay for with Jimmy G, not much. I do feel like Jimmy Garoppolo will have to be considered at the very least. But then the second option is kind of an interesting one, because this guy, funnily enough, is already in-house, and he did beat the Minnesota Vikings in the playoffs just 2 years ago. Why not Daniel Jones? Let's talk about Daniel Jones for a little second and the unique situation he is in. So, as we all know, Daniel Jones parted way with the Giants. Not necessarily the most amicable of partings, but he did ultimately have to leave that situation, and the Giants wanted him to leave as well, so that's where he was. And then the Vikings decided to pick him up, have him on the practice squad. I do believe they did absorb most of this contract, so they're going to have to, should Daniel Jones stay, determine his extensions and things like that. But Daniel Jones is somewhat interesting in terms of how Kevin O'Connell could utilize him in the run game, in terms of short yardage situation, and in terms of allowing receivers like Jefferson and Addison and a tight end like Hawkinson, as Tattler is a little bit more excited about this one. I do feel like Daniel Jones in this chaos situation is an in-house option that will be inexpensive because of the situation that the Giants presented to the Vikings, and he is someone who can get the job done in the short to intermediate areas of the field, which I feel like Kevin O'Connell is someone who can appreciate that. He's not necessarily going to give you the arm talent like Darnold, but he's going to give you the experience. He started over 60 games in the NFL, and someone who is unselfish in terms of how he thinks of the team, much like Darnold. And so, out of all the options that can be available to the Vikings in this chaos situation, Danny Dimes is, in my opinion, the most appealing out of them. But you know what you get with him, right? You're getting someone who might not really be able to utilize the weapons at his disposal most effectively. You're getting someone who might struggle in the downfield passing game. And most importantly, you're getting someone who, while he does have playoff experience in beating you guys, he is still someone who is raw in that department. And so, I don't necessarily know if Vikings fans would be willing to put up with this risk just because he's an in-house option and they might want to see what they have with him should both Darnold and McCarthy be gone. But out of all of these guys, I don't necessarily think he hurts you the most. I mean, Garoppolo might be more appealing in terms of his experience, but I don't necessarily know if he's more appealing in terms of operation of this offense. And Danny Dimes does, for the most part, know this offense. He's seen this offense in practice many times. And I feel like in certain moments, in ways that Kevin O'Connell may like more than other options, he can operate this offense effectively enough so that everyone is happy, much like they were under Darnold, and most importantly, to the point where they can still be considered contenders in this NFC. And like Taptler suggested, this NFC North is wide open. Who knows what the first year of the Ben Johnson era in Chicago is going to look like? Who knows what the new look Lions will look like now that they're going to have to replace the offensive coordinator position and most likely the defensive coordinator position as well. And the Packers, they really crumbled on the start of the season, and against elite teams, they struggled all year. So this could be a moment where the Vikings, should they suddenly start to lose a couple of vital pieces, might look to the in-house option and say, hey, Darnold's gone, McCarthy's gone, but we have a guy in Daniel Jones we brought in, and he knows this offense, and in this very crowded, unfamiliar, and expected NFC North, why not us with Danny Dimes? And so that's why I feel like out of all the options this article did present, he is someone who can operate this offense. And then the last option is perhaps the most unknown option, and an option that I feel like is so outlandish and far-fetched that I just had to laugh when I initially read it. I feel like this guy has raw potential, but I don't necessarily know if the Vikings can trust him as a starter. But he does have a lot of traits that O'Connell does like, and while he's not as experienced as these other two guys, he certainly is still a younger option who can give you a lot of good years should he bear fruit in a new home. And that guy is Trey Lance. Let's talk about Trey Lance. He's had a weird start to his NFL career, right? He was a top 3 draft pick with a lot of hype coming out of the draft, coming out of his college career at North Dakota State, where he went with prolific quarterbacks outside of Carson Wentz from the FCS level. But after a couple failings in San Francisco, a couple injuries there as well, he's found himself as a third-string quarterback for Dallas, not getting much playing time. And so I do feel like if the Vikings are in crisis mode and they're looking for a guy, he certainly would not be the first name on their list. But let's look at the positives. He's still only 24 years old. He has all the traits that a guy like Kevin O'Connell would love: the arm talent, the dual threat ability, and the ability to operate play action at a high level. And since he's an unknown commodity, a lot of NFL teams, unlike Minnesota, will be looking to pass him over. And so if you want to take that risk and say we might want to bring in someone new, potentially as a bridge quarterback, then why not Trey Lance? And it would be interesting to see as well. Say if Minnesota moves on from Darnold and reinstates a guy like McCarthy and gives McCarthy the keys to the car. It will be interesting to see if they bring in someone like Trey Lance to compete with him a little bit, with a similar age, who can really push him as well. That would give you a very young QB room, yes, a highly inexperienced one, yes, but one with a lot of raw potential as well. As Taptler says, KOC needs a playoff win before he takes on more reclamation projects. And I feel like if you're looking at it from a perspective of, okay, both Darnold and McCarthy are gone, like I'm thinking, like this article was thinking, then Trey Lance would have to be considered, because that's crisis mode for the Vikings, because they truly believed in J.J. McCarthy when they drafted him that high. But if, say, it's just Darnold moving on, and you keep McCarthy, and you want him to be pushed in training camp, and you want youth, and you want reclamation projects behind a guy like McCarthy, who himself is a reclamation project now that we think of it, then why not take a chance on Trey Lance? You would have McCarthy, Jones, and Lance in your QB room, and most importantly, youth and inexpensive contracts as well. So it's not like Lance would be a massive monster investment. It would just be that it would bolster the youthful exuberance of this quarterback room, so to speak, if that. And ultimately, this is just a crisis situation, just a whimsical article I read on CBS Sports that I was inspired by. And let me know what you think. If you're also a Viking fan, tap to learn in the comments, because coming up next, we transition to the world of men's college basketball and a very intriguing Wooden Award race and Freshman of the Year race as Cooper Flagg is gaining ground on a man who simply can't do anything about it, Johnny Broome, as he nurses an injury. I'll be right back after this short break to talk about that.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows. Available everywhere
Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. And for our fourth segment of today's show, let's talk a little men's college basketball, shall we? It's been a very interesting year. We've already talked about some teams that could win it all come March Madness time. Let's talk about some players that have defined the college basketball season thus far. Two in particular, deking it out for the Wooden Award, and a freshman who would only be the fourth freshman to win the Wooden Award in men's college basketball history. Cooper Flagg going up against Johnny Broome. Now let's talk first about Johnny Broome, who's had a remarkable season but now faces some time off with a quote-unquote significant ankle injury, as we've heard from Auburn's camp. But before he went down with that ankle injury, he was averaging career highs in points, rebounds, and assists, and ultimately was seen as the frontrunner for the Wooden Award by many in the college basketball circle. But enter Cooper Flagg. This kid has been incredible for a Duke team led by youth. 3 freshmen start for this Duke basketball team, and Cooper Flagg has really been the difference maker to really control Duke's destiny. And it's the reason why a lot of people are considering them not just one of the 1 seeds in the March Madness bracket, but also the number 1 overall seed. And he's the reason why a group of freshmen is one of the best teams in the country. And most importantly, to top it all off, whilst Broome has been sitting out with this injury, he's been delivering some of his best performances of the season. 42 points against Notre Dame, 28 points just a couple days ago, and he's doing it at a very high level. Now granted, like I said, only 4 freshmen have ever won the Wooden Award for best college basketball player, and Zion Williamson was one of them. And Zion Williamson had a crazy stat line. Let's talk about Cooper Flagg's stat line. At the start of the season, he was kind of developing and going through the motions a little bit, getting along, getting the feel of college basketball along with his teammates in Con Kneppel and Kaman Malwak, who have also been playing a little bit better over these past couple of weeks in the toughness of the ACC. But I do feel like Cooper Flagg has been the one to elevate his game in a way that can challenge Johnny Broome should he come back before March Madness. The stat line before the whole Broome injury: 17.6 points per game, 8.5 assists per game, 3.7 rebounds, 1.3 blocks, 1.6 steals. Incredible two-way stat line, but not a split that ultimately catapults you into frontrunner status in terms of the Wooden Award. Not necessarily career numbers for Johnny Broome, a player who has been the paragon of consistency over the past couple of years in men's college basketball for an Auburn Tigers team that's consistently been in the top 25 in the upper echelons of the top 25 as that. And definitely not the numbers of a guy like Zion Williamson, who was one of those freshmen to win the Wooden Award. But after his performance against Notre Dame, his best performance of the season in a critical matchup in the ACC for Duke, his stats skyrocketed. 24.3 points per game, 7.2 assists per game, 4.5 rebounds per game, shooting 54.5% from three. And that's what you love to see out of a guy like Cooper Flagg. And I feel like if this continues, if this narrative keeps getting pushed, I do feel like Cooper Flagg will start gaining ground. But I do feel like another aspect, a narrative of the situation, is how Auburn will be able to play without Johnny Broome, and subsequently how Duke plays up the stretch, because it's still a young team, and this Wooden Award race doesn't get decided until the end of March Madness, right? So say Duke and Auburn finish with similar records, and Johnny Broome misses most of the rest of the regular season, comes back, say, a couple of games before March Madness, and Cooper Flagg and Duke have, say, the number one seed. Maybe not the overall number one seed, but a performance at that level. At that point, I would say Cooper Flagg would win the Wooden Award hands down, because it means that he's achieved the status of not just the best freshman, but the best player in the country, and he's doing it in a way that really bolsters this Duke squad that really needs him to be their best player. Because look at this team. Outside of Caleb Foster and Tyrese Proctor, Con Kneppel and Kaman Malwalk are great players. They're very specific players, right? Con Kneppel is their perimeter guy. He can shoot the three better than most on that team. And Kaman Malwalk is the game wrecker down low, grabbing the rebounds, driving to the rim, really occupying space in the paint. But Cooper Flagg is the best two-way player out of that freshman crop. He can do it all. He can steal the ball from you, get forward in transition, he can shoot the three, he can drive to the basket, he can bring the ball up. And I feel like that aspect of his game is entirely underrated, especially for someone who's a freshman expected to lead this Duke team to, at the very least, a Elite Eight or Final Four. Then let's look at Johnny Brown and what he might have to do to maintain his status as a Wooden Award favorite. Because the situation I put forth is definitely difficult to come back from, but it's not insurmountable if Auburn goes on a run in the tournament. And when we look at Auburn, this is a team that for the first time in quite some time has a lot of transfers within it. They've had to rebuild through the portal, but they also have a couple of freshman stars. Tahad Pettiford, someone who I'm familiar with as a New Jersey kid, watching him play with Hudson Catholic, who can also be an incredible player for this Auburn program. But they definitely have a lot of interesting players who transferred over. Denver Jones, Chad Baker-Mazara, Miles Kelly, all guys who can really help this program, as we've seen in their first win without Johnny Broome. Yes, it was a close game, but ultimately that these guys can perform, and these young guys can perform as well. So I think that the narrative surrounding Auburn and Johnny Broome is that if Auburn performs well without Johnny Broome, it might be to his detriment. But if Auburn does struggle without him, maybe win a couple games, but not necessarily as handily as they would with him, then that also bolsters his case. And it also depends on the timeline of this injury. As of right now, I'm not necessarily certain when he comes back, but if the significance of this injury is as severe as it sounds, it looks like he might miss almost all of the rest of the regular season to try and come back from March Madness, which would mean that this Duke team just has more time to coalesce, more time to grow, most importantly, prepare for a March Madness run. Auburn, on the other hand, is really going to have to figure out life without Johnny Broome, and when he comes back, it might be a little bit static in how they play, because they would have grown so comfortable without him that reintegrating him back into the squad would be tough. even though he, in his own right, is one of the best two-way players in the country, and it might not matter. So ultimately, it's really down to 3 or so things. The development of Duke as a team, because if Cooper Flagg makes everyone better around him, which is already starting to happen, then I think that just goes to show how mature he already is as a freshman, and even gives him more momentum in this Wooden Award race. The timeline of this Johnny Broom injury and the ground he might have to make up. Because with the timeline of the injury, it's really difficult to tell how many games he'll miss. And then, come March Madness time, how he'll look subsequently after returning from such a long layoff. Because if he can't get into the flow of things with a couple of regular season games before March Madness, then I don't know how he's going to look come tournament time. Because granted, anything can happen in March Madness. And much like last year, in that game against Yale, you know what can happen to a team like Auburn, who have been so dominant under Bruce Pearl these past couple of years, but have not been able to break through. So it's going to be interesting to see how, in the months that Auburn are broomless, how Duke and Flagg grow and coalesce to become the juggernaut that a lot of people think they are, because that's an important part of Flagg's winning campaign, is being a solid player, but also helping this team grow, because that's something that I feel like wasn't the case for Zion, because he had a lot of talent around him, but is the case for Flagg because he's one of 3 freshmen who are in this Duke squad and who are relied upon to lead them to the promised land. So ultimately, let's see how Duke improve. They're already showing signs of growth. Knapples looked a little better over the past couple of weeks. If they play Mal Walk a little bit more, let's see how he grows as a good two-way center, and how, these depth pieces like Malik Brown, like Proctor, like Foster can really help and bolster them. But then let's also see how Auburn performs as well, because it might mean that if they perform badly, then Broom could be seen as the quote-unquote savior, and that could bolster his campaign. But it's going to get hectic down the stretch. But for now, just know that Flagg is gaining ground, and it could all very well lead to him being the freshman of the year and the 4th freshman ever to win the Wooden Award. But let me know what you think about the situation in the comments below, because coming up to conclude today's show, we look at a top 6 showdown over the weekend in the Premier League between Man City and Chelsea. 2 teams in interesting form. Let's talk about how this game could define their season. We'll be right back after this short break. Hello everyone, and welcome back into the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. And for our final segment of today's show, we transition overseas to the Premier League, talking about a top 6 showdown between 2 teams looking for a win that could define their respective seasons in Manchester City and Chelsea. Both of them in intriguing form, But ultimately, the winner of this one controlling their own destiny as to how they can secure a Champions League place, even though England at the moment are holding court in terms of the extra Champions League spot. So it may not be as important as I think it is, but ultimately it could be the win that drives the momentum of this team. But ultimately, let's look into this particular matchup and how both teams match up. Let's talk about City first and foremost. Very, very interesting last couple of months for City, where a lot of people thought they were in crisis. Pep Guardiola acknowledged it, and ultimately they looked like the team that just aged a little bit too quickly, right? They couldn't compensate for the loss of a player like Rodri. They, as Anthony Mazzano said, are surprised that Chelsea has been playing this well because it seems like people thought they were in rebuild. We'll talk about Chelsea in a little bit, and we'll talk about how intriguingly well they've been playing considering the fact they have so many different players who can contribute. But I do think City are the more interesting case study here because granted, this is a fascinating team. We're going to talk about all the transfer business they have done in this window a little bit later on in the week. But I still think that this City team has all of its goals in front of them, right? I don't necessarily think they're going to win the Premier League, but they can still qualify for the Champions League. Yes, they're going to be thinking about the breaches in the back of their mind and the trials they'll have to go through. But ultimately, if they can just secure top 4, potentially run Arsenal and Forest close in their chase of Liverpool and ultimately end up a little bit higher in the table, then so be it. But I still think that Man City are a team that no one likes to think, as Anthony Mazzano says, the picture and the tag next to you don't match. I'm not necessarily certain what that means, but thank you for the comment. I hope I can address it soon. But ultimately, yeah, this is going to be an interesting game because both of these teams are in interesting form. Chelsea, the one with the midweek game against Wolves, obviously, kind of snapping that 5-game losing streak. And then City, 5 games unbeaten, but had 2 draws mixed in there, one against Brentford, which you expected them to win. But ultimately, their 6-0 thrash of Ipswich gives hope that maybe this attack has found its footing. Let's talk about the last time these teams met, because this is an interesting topic here. The last time these teams met, City won 2-0, with Haaland and Kovacic the goal scorers. And in that game, I feel like Chelsea were not the same team as they are now. I feel like this Chelsea team has really coalesced, and even in this 5-game losing streak, or streak in which they did not win games, I do think they had a couple draws in there as well. They still are finding ways to compete with the bloated roster they have. Kudos to Enzo Maresca, a manager who a lot of Chelsea fans may not have even heard of at the start of this season, but has really developed this team into something exhibiting a potential top 4 side, and maybe in future years a true title contender. But now, in this specific matchup, it's going to be about, which of these teams' best players, especially in their attack, can really control the tenor of this game. And for Man City, it's been Phil Foden. No player has scored more goals this year in 2025 than Phil Foden. And he's been someone who had a slow start to the year but is now gaining momentum. And yes, you can say that he's faced not necessarily the best of opponents these past couple of weeks. Obviously, Ipswich, certainly not one of the best, but still someone who can really change the outcome of a game. And for Chelsea, obviously, it's a guy like Cole Palmer who has been in a bit of a rough patch over the past couple of weeks, but still someone who I believe can get going at any time, controls the tempo of this Chelsea squad really well. So ultimately going to be an interesting matchup in the midfield. But I do want to address a comment from Anthony Manzano as well. With Manchester United, since you're talking about the Premier League, how unlikely can you see them being demoted the amount of money they spend? I feel like this is more in correlation to the question of whether or not they're relegation candidates and how much money they could lose in that affair. But ultimately, I'm not necessarily too worried about, their payroll, even though Ineos hasn't necessarily shown the initiative to change their worldview compared to the Glazers, at least not from what we've seen. But ultimately, if you're talking about Man United as being in a serious relegation race, I'm not ready to worry just yet. They just need to spend the money they have more wisely and diagnose how they want to build this team. Because if you want to develop young players, that's all fine and dandy. But if you do want to compete now in the Premier League, you're not going to do it as now. I understand what you were saying, my friend, and I will change accordingly. Thank you for that update, Anthony Manzano. But ultimately, I do think heading into this matchup, this Man City-Chelsea clash, this one, in terms of importance, may not matter as much as I'm emphasizing it, because at the end of the day, England might secure the extra Champions League spot, and for the time being, both of these teams would occupy those spots. This is more for a morale boost, because both of these teams, as Splasher says, being where MU feels like relegation. I definitely feel you now that as a quote-unquote Tottenham fan, not a full Tottenham fan, but someone who follows Tottenham religiously, I do feel like talking about top 6 sides in a relegation fight is weird, but that's the current state of these two teams. They don't spend their money wisely. They don't necessarily make the best transfer decisions, and ultimately I don't think their ownership are focused on running football clubs like they should be, which is about play on the field. They're running them more of their own businesses. And so that's my concern with clubs like Man United and Spurs. But speaking about clubs who I initially thought were being run like a business, but now trying to bear fruit on the field, Chelsea, if they win this matchup, I do feel like have a foundation where you start to think of them as legit contenders for the future, not necessarily for now because they might just be out of the title race, but certainly building the foundation needed to consistently stay in this top 4. Whereas a Man City win would ultimately bring them to the precipice of getting over this very rough patch, this very rough couple of months, clear their minds a little bit, and reset for this new year as they're gaining momentum. So that's what I think this game will establish. Which of these teams in the top 6 are going to be thinking a bit more positively after the weekend? And so that's what I think will be the ultimate goal heading into this one for both of these teams. As another comment comes in from Anthony Manzano, I think Manchester United has changed their philosophy. They might be used as a filter for Chelsea, Arsenal, and Manchester City to develop their young players on loan. And I hear you, because that's certainly what seems to be happening now. Garnacho is already being put up on the table for potential signing from Napoli. Rashford could be out, as Anthony Manzano says, whereas Arsenal in the top 6, they are second right now, tied with Nottingham Forest, above them on goal difference. And we can talk about them as well in terms of their push for top spot or Premier League titles. But ultimately, I feel like, the way the top 6 is now viewed, it's really a crapshoot as to who's getting momentum. Right now, it's Liverpool, and Arsenal feel like a little step below the elites of the top 6, like the Liverpools and Cities of the world as we've seen in previous title races with them. But I do feel like the landscape of the Premier League's Big 6 is now changing, and these two teams can certainly define it as well. Because if Man City, as Anthony Manzano said, has shocked you that Nottingham is tied for second, no one expected them to be that good during the preseason, correct? I feel like I'm a little bit shocked, but considering as to how if you have a solid back line in the Premier League, and you have a coach in Nuno who has been through the ringer in the Premier League before, understands what it takes to eke out results in the Premier League, then a team like Forest might not be as shocking to see in the top half. We're seeing teams like Bournemouth, Fulham now get into the top half with imposing back lines. So like I said again, the top 6 is ever changing. But I guess to conclude perfectly based off your comments, Anthony, looking at this game, this might not even be, say, an important game in the title race for the next couple of years as well. If I begin to talk about games like Man City and Chelsea and games that involve Arsenal or Liverpool in the future, they might not bear as much weight as games involving teams like Bournemouth and Nottingham Forest who are actually playing for something, playing for more than Big Six supremacy, so to speak. Which is interesting because Man City and Chelsea are both at points where they can take advantage of the slip-ups of some of these lower-tier teams like Bournemouths, like Fulhams, like Brightons of the world, and say we're still the top 4, top 6 sides in the Premier League. But right now, I'm not certain because both of these teams are in rough patches. Chelsea kind of got out of theirs in a week. City had the Ipswich treatment where you get immediate morale boost beating them. But this game has to be taken seriously by both of them because neither one of them wants to lose and have to go into the weekend thinking, okay, now we're going to have to really push on in the last stages of the campaign. But we'll see. As Anthony Manzano said, that's the way we look at it. Usually Nottingham and Bournemouth are usually playing to avoid relegation to compete for a championship. Well, that might be the landscape we're looking at now, my friend, because, like I said, if you have tactical managers who understand what it takes in the Premier League, the Iraolas, the Nunos of the world, potentially a guy like Marco Silva, then you can compete in this league because of the tenor of the Big Six right now. Yes, Liverpool and Man City and Chelsea and Arsenal are all there and thereabouts, but now you're seeing the Spurs and Man Uniteds of the world fall in the table. And right now, forgive me for saying this, but we're forgetting about the 115 breaches for Man City. We're forgetting about the chaos that happened before Enzo Maresca's arrival at Chelsea. We're forgetting about, all the rumors about Liverpool, as absurd as they seem. We're forgetting about Arsenal's failure to compensate for depth in the transfer window. So all of these teams have their flaws. It's how they figure them out. But to conclude, I think that this game particularly is going to be very interesting in terms of how the narrative shifts around teams in the Big Six compared to the teams like Nottingham and Bournemouth. But that will just about do it for today's show. Thank you for tuning in to the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast, brought to you, as always, by the GSMC Sports Network. I've been Christopher Shepard. Thank you for tuning in. We'll be back here tomorrow, as always, at 3:30 Eastern Time. Other than that, like, follow, and subscribe. Use the Super Chat, Super Things, and Super Stickers features as well to contribute and interact with the show. But other than that, I am out.